This is a panel that is part of the PanACEa conference, which is the first ever Pan-Asian conference organized to examine asexuality in the Asian context and celebrate our spectrum, which is the asexual aro spectrum, and queer identities. We also have narratives from outside of us, Asia, but we're obviously highlighting Asian narratives because it's so infrequently discussed. So I'm going to do a round of introductions. I mean, everybody's going to introduce themselves, but my name is Tejasvi. My pronouns are they and she. And I'm a journalist and editor at Gazy Family, which is a queer media platform run and owned by queer people, focused on queer narratives from the Indian subcontinent. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves. I'm going to call everyone by name, and then I'm actually going to pick one person and they can pass the ball to somebody else. So maybe we can start with Kate.
Hello, I'm Kate. I live in Australia on Ngunnawal and Narrabri land, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and acknowledge that the land was stolen and never ceded. I have so many disabilities. I have a number of mental illnesses, including bipolar and an eating disorder. And I also have fibromyalgia, which is a chronic illness and a pain condition, and chronic fatigue syndrome. And I have a neurological order, a neurological disorder called functional neurological disorder, which causes a lot of different problems throughout the body. And a lot of them have to do with thinking, making me think slower, making me talk slower. And I also have a lot of trauma, which is related to my asexuality. And that trauma has caused the functional neurological disorder and has a part in bipolar as well. So some of my disabilities really, they're really linked to my asexuality in a way that I can't really separate them. So that's me. And as you can see, I work from bed office because of my disabilities. And I will pass on to my fellow Australian, Gemma.
Hi, my name's Gemma, and here's our comment again. And my pronouns are she, her. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I live on and work on, the Wallamedigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and their continued connections to land, sea and community, and acknowledge that this land was stolen and sovereignty was never ceded. And I'm on this panel because I am neurodivergent and I have psychosocial disabilities, including borderline personality disorder, multitude of anxiety disorders, depression, and I have also a multitude of chronic health conditions, uveitis, thalassemia, asthma, and a bunch of other little bits and pieces that roll in hypermobility as well. So yeah, that's me. And I am going to pass on to Divya.
Okay, thank you, Gemma. So my name is Divya. My pronouns are they, she. I'm a psychologist and I'm a therapist. Of course, I work as a person-centered therapist. I also identify as neurodivergent, predominantly ADHD, but I'm also looking, currently exploring the possibilities of autism. The kind of work that I do majorly works with, I'm majorly grounded in the concept of social constructionism, which means that I acknowledge that everybody has their own lived experience and everybody has their own reality by that logic. So in my work with my clients, I give them that kind of autonomy. So when someone narrates their stories to me, I validate that as their story. So that's my approach. So I have a relational style and a social constructionist style. I'm on this panel because of my neurodivergence. Also, I've been exploring asexuality pretty sure that I have been asexual all my life, but just haven't known it. And I think this conference has just been a wonderful means for me to come closer to my understanding. Yeah, I think I'm gonna enjoy being here today. Thank you.
And whom do you pass the ball on to?
I would pass the ball on to Safar.
Thank you. So hi, my name is Sofia Lama and my pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I identify myself as a queer demioasis, and currently I'm working on NGO and I'm a queer counselor practitioner too, and also I run the page Queer Disability Nepal. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Safar.
I
And
like
I think,
now.
yeah, Yagna's the only one left. And Yagna, you're on mute and your camera's off. If you can turn them both on, please. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Yagna and I'm from India. My pronouns are they, them. Some I identify as pan-demisexual and pan-aromantic. Some I have never had to really come out to it. It was like I made it too painfully obvious. So I'm hard of hearing. I will hear it is on the light side. And I communicate by lip reading and visual cues. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Yagna. All right, thanks everybody for introducing yourself. I'm also on the A spectrum and I'm autistic. And yeah, I am, for me, both my identities really intersect. And that's how I discovered both of them, actually. I discovered my asexuality first, and then it just made sense for me to realize that I was also autistic. I could not read a lot of these signals that people sent out when they wanted, like the whole mating call and things like that. So yeah, I would love to begin by asking Kate, how did you discover that you were asexual? And you also shared as to how some of your disabilities and some of the trauma that you carry are from being asexual or from being identified as asexual. Could you tell us a little more about that, Kate?
Oh, I actually discovered I was asexual when my boyfriend at the time sort of told me that I was.
How old were you?
26.
Okay.
So I guess I had always known from my teens that something was not right, that I was different in some way, that I was weird, and that had certainly been told to me by others. So I knew that I was different, and I for a time thought that I was gay because I didn't like men. So I must, like, the alternative was that I liked women. That was really the only thing that I could have a concept of. But yeah, it was eventually my boyfriend who said to me that you're asexual, and then I knew that he was right as soon as he said it. But it really all ties together because, and this might be a sort of triggering thing to say for some people, but when I was 16, 17, probably 17, I was a victim of corrective sexual assault. So I didn't know I was asexual at that time. And the people that assaulted me didn't know that I was asexual, but they knew that I was frightened of sex. They knew that I was frightened of boys, I suppose. And so what they did was to try and fix me and make me not like that anymore, to try and make me normal about and behave normally about sex. And that didn't work. It just made me worse, and it created a lot of trauma for me that it took me more than 15 years before I really said anything or told anyone. I was, I think, 33 before I talked to anybody about it. And that was, it was my friends my asexual friends who I talked to about it first. And then, you know, after that, I talked to other friends, and then my parents, and then from there, different people. And, you know, now we know that that trauma is that trauma is one of the causes of my neurological problems. We know that trauma can cause bipolar. So it's certainly the cause of my anxieties. You know, it's really hard to untangle what causes what. And of course, that trauma has made me vulnerable to other things that happened in my life, which, you know, when you're a victim of an early victim of one kind of trauma, you then can become more susceptible to being a victim of trauma again. And so it's really absolutely impossible to say what kind of person I would be today and what disabilities I would have if that early trauma hadn't happened to me. So it's all tied up together, and I cannot really remove my asexuality from my disabilities.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm gonna quickly jump to Divya, who is a practicing therapist. So Divya, could you please tell us, like, in your practice, have you ever seen a client of yours who might be asexual, or who might be grappling with, you know, how they could be asexual, or how they feel abnormal or weird, or something's not right with them, like how Kate put it? That is that idea, right? If sex and sexuality is considered the foundation of who we are, even in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sex comes first. But for a lot of us, that's not necessarily true. And, you know, maybe we approach intimacy in different ways, and we get our needs met for affection, for intimacy, met in different ways. So how do clients usually approach it, and how have you and your understanding of asexuality really kind of changed over a period of time with your practice?
Okay. So in my experiences, I mean, the things that I will say will probably combine my experiences. I mean, it'll just be a narrative of sorts. I hope that works. So I think what I've understood is that I've just heard people say this very often. Sex is the base of love for a lot of people. When people think about love and relationships, they can't seem to separate sex from love at all. In fact, I have had that problem for the longest time, because I think that could also be a cultural thing. Also, the kind of movies that we saw when we were growing up, the kind of portrayals that happened in media, it just was, you know, sort of given that kind of cadence that, when you love someone, you have sex with them, or if you're attracted to someone, it has to be a sexual attraction of sorts. I think for the longest time, I haven't even known what sexual attraction even means, because I've experienced all these other kinds of attractions. And I think I told myself, because I feel this intense desire to be around the person, let's say, maybe what that means is I'm sexually attracted to them. And then when it came down to the actual act of engaging in sex, or even talking about sex, thinking about sex, it did not seem right after all. And interestingly, because you asked about my clients, there are actually people who, when they come into therapy, they don't.
I'm sorry, 1 second. I think Yagna has something to say. I'm so sorry, but I think they had just sent something on chat. So just hold that thought. Yagna, is everything okay?
So I just wanted to add to Divya's point that it's also due to this baby we should act. You know, the sex, how it is seen as baby act. So I just wanted to add this.
Okay. All right. Yagna, you can add more. We'll come to you soon. Sorry, Divya. Continue.
Yeah, no problem. That works. So because you mentioned the client bit, I think.
Oh, you can continue. I just specified there is that most cases when Divya said that when you love a person, they should have sex. Then it's also to how it is stigmatized.
Yagna, could you hold on to that thought? Could you hold that thought? We will come to you.
Yes.
Divya is just completing what they have to say. No worries. Go ahead, Divya.
It's okay. It's all right. So since we were talking about my clients, So a lot of these clients, that who come into therapy. So when I think about anyone, when we think about people in general, how they approach the concept of sexuality also changes with time. So a lot of the time when people come into therapy, they're not aware of how they want to see sex just yet. They might, in fact, a lot of the Indian clientele, a lot of people that I work with are young people, and they might be living at home. And let's say they move out of home, move away from home, and they suddenly experience a situation where they have more freedom to experiment, to discover things about themselves. Then they seem to, come into this kind of pressure where they need to understand what their sexuality looks like, because there are all these peers around them who understand it perhaps, and force that on them and try to make them feel, why don't you feel the same attraction, or why don't you feel the same things that I feel? And that's very similar to, let's say, even being attracted to a peer, to a colleague, to a let's say someone you're going to college with. And those two things overlap. So there is the concept of peer pressure, which is peers telling you, how can you not be attracted? And then there's the other thing where you yourself are attracted to some peers, but possibly they don't reciprocate the same way because their concept of attraction is different. And that's when the therapeutic work really comes into the sexual focus. Like, we really talk about these things in session then. And it is not uncommon to see that a lot of these questioning questions, I would say, a lot of these people who are questioning their identity or their behaviors are actually moving towards that side. And this has heavy interactions with autism, particularly ADHD, of course, as well, but with autism, because like you said, right, the social interaction, the knowing, the flirting, how flirting is even seen in general, is completely different from how an autistic person would see just general interactions. So there is quite a bit of an overlap. And I'd be happy to talk more about this as we go along, about the social components. But yeah, for now, I think that would be it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sofia. Yagna, you were saying you had some points to make. Please go ahead. You're on mute, Yagna.
I just wanted to add a small point to Divya's, about how sex is more stigmatized to or reduced to only for baby making act. So that's all I wanted to add.
You're saying that sex is mostly seen as an act for mating, right? Like, it's seen as a kind of thing that you do for reproduction. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm sorry. I don't know if I caught that correctly, but we'll come back to you, Yagna. Safal, I'm curious. How are things in Nepal? How is the community, whether it's a queer community or the larger community, how are they accepting of asexuality? How crucial is sex to, some of the social functions and hierarchies and things like that? Please enlighten us on that bit.
So thank you for the questions. Yeah. So first of all, talking about my journey at first. So it was so first of all, when I talk about my journey and when I identify in the spectrum of the asexuality, I feel that it was so confusing, because being myself as a physical disabled and talking about the asexuality as sexual orientations, it was so confusing because people are in Nepal too, like in South Asia, might be.
There is some static noise from your end, Safal.
Yeah. Sorry, outside there was making a home, that's why. Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry for that. So in Nepal, I think it's like same like India, like Divya said, like it's so confusing when we talk about love. It's just about sex, like sex is a strong bond of love. Yeah, and like my journey was so confusing in one point. Like Yeah, I like to say that. And when it attached with my disability, and like people are not able to understand whether the person, whether me is a queer person, or whether they are confused on, in which box they need to make me fit. Like
Yeah.
they want to make me fit on the disability, they want to make me fit on the queer community, but I fit on both the boxes, and I like to express both. And but they are even confused. Even they say that it's not okay to identify both, or it's not good to identify both because it's hard to understand. So you have to be in one boxes. But I never think about that comment. I never think about I always think about, what I like and what's my orientation, and I'm proud,
Yeah.
like being a disabled. Yeah, that's why that was my personal journey. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Safal. I'm going to move to Gemma right now. Gemma, you have considerable experience as an asexual activist and interacting with a lot of activists in this space. And how has it been? Like, what does activism in this space look like? Because to me, it just seems like the A spectrum is quite complex. There are people who are demisexual, there are people who are gray sexual, and everybody is on the A spectrum. And for some reason, there is this idea that asexual people don't seek out sexual relationships, or they don't seek out romantic relationships. How do you kind of deal with all of these different narratives and tie it together in your activism?
Well, that's actually a really interesting point, because there is such a vast difference between everybody in the ACE community. And I find that it's what brings us together, like what we can find that we have in common rather than what separates us, I guess, is more, which is why I'm really interested in forging connections interstate in Australia, but also with overseas, which is one of the reasons I was very keen to be on this panel. I mean, I didn't mention before, but I have ADHD as well. But my experience with being an activist is that a lot of the time people they try to box ACEs into that, oh, asexuals don't like sex, or asexuals are, they just give it like a very shallow definition, I suppose. And it's there's so much depth in the differences between all of us, but it's also the things that we have in common that bring us together. And I think that's really important to highlight, particularly given lockdowns and COVID and all the stuff we're currently going through. I mean, that's why Aussie Ace Week was online, so that we could connect with people outside of our usual little bubble. So I mean, it's really sorry, can you reread the question for me, because I've just had a mental blank.
No worries. No, I was curious about, like, there are so many narratives around being ace, right? There are so many different ways of being ace. So what does activism really look like in this community? I'm asking that because you have so much experience connecting with activists, and yeah.
Well, I mean, I found Avon in 2005. So Kate knew I was ace before she knew she was ace. And I mean, back then it was quite small. There was maybe 6,000 people on there as members. Now there's 130,000 plus. So it has come a long way. I was there when people just decided on what the flag was going to be like. And in some ways it has changed a lot. The landscape has changed a lot, and some things are still the same. I mean, we're still doing ACE 101 when I was doing ACE 101 back in 2009. You know, so we have a lot of but we have a lot of diversity, whether it's neurodivergence, or whether it's a lot of, I mean, we've got our own disability panel on later on, and even just between the ACEs we've got on there, everyone has a different story, and everybody brings something different to the table. And I think that makes the community itself much richer, because we can all learn from each other, and we can also understand the world around us, particularly when we're not neurodivergent, when we see other people's experiences, or we can go, hang on, no, actually, that's my experience too. And whether we speak different languages, whether we, whether we're neurodivergent or not, there are, like we can see the similarities, but also understand more outside of our own sphere. And I think that I think we are making progress in being more accepting of everyone's differences in the world, particularly most of the ACEs I know are some of the most open-minded and kind and understanding people that I've known. And I've known Kate well before either of us were part of the ACE community. And she's probably going to get embarrassed when I say this, but I feel like Kate epitomizes what I would want the ACEs in my life to be like. She is kind and understanding, and she listens to other people where even if she might not agree with you, and she takes in all the information around that's in the conversation. And I find that when people are like that, it's much easier to rely on them. It's much easier to have them as a friend, even if they live across the country or even if they live across the world. So it really, I think that it's really important that the community is really important, whether it's the neurodivergent community or it's the ACE community or both, that it really has become really important in the last couple of years, particularly to really make those connections with people. And we can do that. We've got the technology to do it, so I think it's really important.
On that note, Yagna, I was wondering, how do you, as somebody who is ACE and who is also living with a physical disability, how do you access community? How do you access information? What sort of information were you able to access when it came to wanting to understand your asexuality, wanting to find a community that was also supportive of your ACE identity? How did that go for you? I was also wondering if Tanisha, you could help me by typing out these questions for Yagna and sending it to them in the chat. I think that might be helpful for them.
All right, on it.
Thank you, Tanisha.
Yeah. Can you just repeat the question for me as
Yeah,
well?
my question is, as somebody who is ACE, as well as somebody who lives with a physical disability, how does Yagna usually, how have they navigated accessing information, and also how have they navigated finding a community that is supportive of both their disability as well as their ACE identity?
Okay.
I'll give you a minute to type it out.
I should answer, right?
Yes.
Okay, so as a hard of hearing person, most of the time I cannot retain information in hearsay, right? So mostly, obviously, like the internet is the survival of the information for me.
Yeah.
Actually, first, it came from my sibling that I came to know that as spectrum exists, like demisexual, pansexual, and all. So I'm on a thin line between demi and gray. So like sometimes I alternate between those two. So like I realized that those two exist. And with my disability, I had to never think for it to be intersective. But now, as not binary and body over emotional attraction, I think dating is harder because of as not binary disabled and part of asexuality community or spectrum. So if this is the in regards of dating, there is it's an intersection between the disability and the sexuality. Otherwise, the complete separate, they do not intersect for me.
Yeah.
In my case, I remember when I discovered that I'm part of maybe was when I was going through a bad phase like 2 years ago, and I started to hook it up as a coping mechanism. Uh, but it was also my self-discovery. I got the chance of self-discovery. And that's when I came to know that I'm sorry. I hook up with leaving. I poured over emotional collection. So at first I was skeptical. Like I thought it was okay. It's obvious you do not just go with strangers or something. So, but I meet persons who do not relate with my experience. That's when I had to go to the internet. I typed like this question, not as labels. I mean, I didn't even know LGBT community first in the first place. So, like, I typed this question: Why do I hook up with a when we have emotional connection like that? I typed this question, and that's when I came to know that is sexuality is a huge spectrum, and it's like all of you said, we cannot be put to boxes. It is so wide and more than the definitions down offer. So this I have discovered like as it grew up, like from 2 years to now. So that's
Thank you for sharing that, Yagna. I'm going to jump back to Divya and ask about, like, Yagna shared about how they looked things up on the internet and how that was like a source of information for them. But a lot of times when you're trying to kind of put yourself or identify yourself either with asexuality or even with autism, or any other, neurodivergences or invisible disabilities, self-diagnosis is not considered valid. There is always this question about your lived experience. Kate, I see your hand raised. I will come to you right after this. But yeah, Divya, how do you approach this as a mental health care provider? Self-diagnosis is what kind of keeps us hopeful, right?
Yes. In fact, there is a lot of controversy around whether diagnosis has to happen that way. Where we go through the whole process of going to a professional, and then getting it the way that the world will acknowledge it. There are advantages to it, because you see, when we are in college, for example, and let's say we are neurodivergent, it really helps to have a diagnosis, because you can use that to get, let's say, more time when you're giving a test. So when there are instances where where the rest of the world has to kind of help us out, where we need access and support, in those circumstances, getting a diagnosis helps. But I'm also aware of the fact, or let us all be wary of the fact, that not everybody has that kind of access or privilege to get the diagnosis. Right? Diagnosis costs money, it costs time, and it costs a lot of knowing for sure that you can go through that process, because there are people who know that they are neurodivergent, approach a professional, but then don't get the diagnosis that they desire. And medical professionals or mental health professionals might say that, oh, then that's clear, right? You don't have it. Why are you so worried about it? You're not neurodivergent. Just be happy with that. But then they can't be, because for a lot of us who are neurodivergent, our neurodivergence helps us explain so many things that we've lived with
about ourselves,
forever. And it's not fair that one small I honestly don't know. I think professionals also need to get more aware of how they are doing their assessments.
And there's also this discussion about how a lot of these traits are defined based on gender, right? Like autistic, the way it presents itself, and I'm sure this is the case for other neurodivergent conditions as well. How it presents itself in certain, like the cis men cis white men in particular, is
Yeah.
not necessarily how it presents itself in the people of other genders and other identity markers. So yeah.
Yes, in fact, the DSM, which is the the go-to manual for this kind of a diagnosis, was almost entirely based on. Very sorry about the background noise. Was entirely based on the white males, right?
Yeah.
All the work that was done with the DSM was white, and I think there is very little representation in terms of all these other places, because when we think about cultural aspects, social aspects that contribute to our neurodivergence, just like sexuality, those things are almost never factored for in the DSM.
Yeah.
So now, I think the most common understanding of neurodivergence is the young boy who's just very jumpy and very hyperactive. But both ADHD and autism present differently in women, in biological women. I'm just going to say that for now. Of course, gender is a different construct altogether. Biologically speaking, assigned sex speaking, females have a different experience with neurodivergence, and that is not often appreciated or acknowledged. So if I'm in a classroom full of 40 children, which is happens to happen in India, how will a teacher come and understand on a micro level if I'm not a hyperactive young boy who's just jumping around and making a big fuss of myself? How will my teacher know that I might have ADHD? Yeah. So for a lot of us, that's what happened to me, right? I was undiagnosed. I got my diagnosis just last year. So I'm pretty old now. And how did it happen? So these realizations happening at a very late age, I think very similar to, maybe not entirely similar at all, but the trauma conversation, let's just say that. I was going to say Kate, but I'm not going to. The conversation around trauma, where we accumulate things over our lifetime and only realize much later in life that, oh, that's what was going on with me. That's an important conversation to be had, okay? And not a conversation that is had in the diagnosis, circles. So therapists are taking the burden for that, not the diagnosticians, not those professionals who are doing it by a manual. So yes, self-diagnosis is acknowledgeable. Somebody comes to me saying, I have self-diagnosed, I cannot turn them away saying, please go get a formal diagnosis. Then only I will speak to you as a therapist who understands ADHD. I am neurodivergent aware. I am queer affirmative. I think that's enough for right now. We can talk and we can see where this goes. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Divya. Yeah, that did help. I wanted to jump to Kate and ask her about what are your experiences with mental health care providers? Have they been affirmative of your identities? Have they been affirmative of your trauma? Have they been aware of it? And how has your experience been accessing mental health care? And generally support in other forms. Kate. Yeah.
Well, I was given a lot of care and attention actually when I was young, when I was in kind of that high school age, 16, 17. Teachers could tell that there was something wrong. And so they noticed something was wrong with me, but I know I was sent to the in school, like we had counselors in school who would talk to me, but none of them were asking the right questions. So they didn't notice there was ongoing sexual abuse that they did not notice. They didn't ask me what they should have been asking me. And so it was never picked up. And then the mental health system in Australia is probably better than a lot of places, but not as good as we would like it to be. So I have been an inpatient in hospital, in the mental health ward of a hospital, which is where I was diagnosed with bipolar. And I have seen various different kinds, I've seen counselors and therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, all different kinds of doctors with all different kinds of treatments. But what, we finally found what seems to be working for me, I think. And that is when we got down to saying, and I think it actually took me acknowledging that something had happened to me when I was young, but also what was really a turning point for me was when somebody was able to say to me, not just this one thing, but several things that have happened to me, these things were traumas. This was not normal. You're not a weak person who wasn't able to handle normal events in your life. These were traumatic events that were not normal, and you've actually been holding on for a really long time when you shouldn't have had to. And so now I go to counseling, I go to therapy, and we work on helping me cope with these underlying original traumatic events that I went through. Because before that, every kind of treatment they sent me to was just kind of sticking band-aids over this stuff that we'd never addressed before. No one had ever tried to get to the bottom of all these various mental illnesses that I had. And so really my asexuality is kind of tied into it all. So it also was really important that I finally have a psychologist who acknowledges and understands what asexuality is, and she isn't trying to treat the asexuality. Because if she was someone who said, oh, well, your asexuality isn't a real sexual orientation, we have to deal with this, she's not going to be able to help me, because she's going to be focusing on the wrong thing. But because she acknowledges what it is, she's able to say, okay, we don't care about that, we're not worrying about that, we're dealing with what the real issue is, which is your trauma.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to jump to Safal and ask them about how is mental health care, have you ever approached a mental health care provider in Nepal where you live, and how is it? How has your experience been? Are there community care institutions, or how does it work? If somebody wants to learn more about their sexuality and their expression, and even about how to deal with like traumatic events, what is the approach that the community usually takes in Nepal, and what you're aware of in your immediate community?
So yeah, thank you for the questions. First of all, when we talk about the mental health and mental health support group in Nepal, first of all, most people are not aware about there are counselor too, and they are not aware about they can go to the counselor. When we think about going counselor, people think that there are two units too in Nepal, and this is quite difficult to make understand that healthcare and going counselor is okay too. Because in Nepal, people get educated by themselves, or people get know by themselves about their gender and sexuality through learning different from the pages and from Google, because they are not aware about if there is a counselor too for making them understand about their sexuality or not. And also even I'm a queer counselor practitioner. When I meet the people, they didn't talk about how their sexuality and about their sexual orientations. They did not talk about, or like in Nepal, when we talk about gender and sexuality concept, like gender and sexuality, about asexuality or any sexuality, they came into a narrow pointed that they did not want to talk about how they feel, and they didn't want to talk about who they are attracted to. It's quite hard to make them understandable. And when we talk, when we counselor meet, when we practitioner meet to each other, and we talk much about the suicide case, we must talk about different things, not about the gender and sexuality. It's hard, and people are not aware also because our activism, because of our counselor awareness are not being higher and loud to, and because before the lockdown, there was no any things, there was no any loud, like can we say that people are not much aware about counselor in Nepal. After the lockdown, because of lockdown, many things have been changed, and people are much aware of the counselor too. And now people are getting facilitated, and now people are getting a free counseling from the different pages. And And when we talk, even the counselors, even the Nepal counselors are not much aware about queer terminology and queer sexuality, and it's quite hard to decline that, to make themselves understand, because even counselor are not aware about it. Yeah, and it's quite hard, but slowly it will be changed, and because slowly many queer counselor practitioners are involved in counseling therapy, and slowly it's gonna be a change. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Safal. Gemma, I'm also curious as to how does this conversation, in your experience, how does this conversation happen with people, let's say young people, or let's say with their parents? Have you ever had to talk to parents about how their child might be asexual? Maybe it's a teenager or a young person, how they might be asexual, and how to really approach their identity. Have you, and yeah, how do you usually go about that conversation, and what sort of resistance do you face?
So I actually haven't directly talked to anyone's parents about it, but I know Kerry, one of our admin team, has known that they were ace since they were, I think, about 16 or 17. And I know from speaking to aces who are young that there are plenty that don't want to tell their parents because they either assume their parents are going to be judging because they're not, they already know their parents aren't particularly pro LGBT in the first place, and therefore, anything outside the norm is, kind of frowned upon, even though when you actually think about what asexuality is, they're probably less likely to be having the sex as a teenager than a lot of their peers. So it seems a little bit hypocritical for them to be negative about it when the thing that a lot of parents are worried about, because I know my parents and like my friends' parents when I was that age, everyone's like, you can date boys later. Like you don't need to do that now. And I know from watching the community, but also from reading news stuff, that kids are having sex a lot earlier. So I know parents, and I'm in a lot of parent groups because I have a 6-year-old. And the kids they're talking about are obviously teenagers, but there's people saying kids are having sex at like 10 or 11 or 12. And the conversations that parents need to have with their kids about their sexuality is really important, because the schools don't cover it. Australia is in an interesting position because while we are an Anglophone country, we are quite a multicultural country as well. At least we try to be. And we don't have we don't have some of the issues that a lot of our Asia Pacific nation friends do. But we still don't have asexuality as part of our school curriculum. Kate had an interesting stat she had the other day that more people in her research heard about asexuality through fan fiction than they did their health PE stuff at school, which is kind of sad, really. Like I know when I was at school, the only orientation that was even talked about was hetero. That was the only one that it was pretty much, don't have sex. If you're going to have sex, have safe sex. And we don't really want to know about it, so go away. And that's all that said. And my mum is a teacher, and quite a few of her friends are teachers, and from doing clerical work with them as well, that I know that kids are getting a better knowledge base these days than what we got. But it still doesn't cover everything. So they're using the internet and they're searching things up. And and that's why it's really important to, if you can, obviously not every country can do this, but if you can have an asexual group or something that someone can look up, and it helps them not to feel so alone. Because I know when I was in high school, I was quite like Kate. I was weird and a bit different. I got bullied throughout my entire schooling. And I remember feeling that I was different and I had no label for it. And at least if I feel like if I'm putting myself out there, or any of us are putting ourselves out there, and if that helps one person understand themselves better, then I've done my job.
Yeah. I also have a follow-up question for you, Gemma.
Yeah.
Most people think people who live who are asexual, who are identified as being on the asexual spectrum, and who have, let's say, neurodivergence like ADHD, there's no way you can have a family. There's no way you can have, the normal life. How do you usually respond to that? Given that you mentioned that you have a 6-year-old child as well.
Yeah. So
You fit that perfect
Well,
normal life here.
I'm technically still married to his dad. I haven't had a divorce yet, and it's not because I want to stay married to him. We're definitely separated. But people gave me quite a lot of grief because they're kind of like, well, how can you be ace if you've got a kid? And because the assumption they conflate asexuality and aromanticism. And they just assume that, well, if you're not going to have sex in a relationship, well, then you can't have a relationship because it's a given that you're going to do that. And it's just like even within the allosexual community, everybody has a different sexual appetite, interest, and all of that. They've got their own diversity within that. And not everybody in, say a hetero passing relationship wants the same stuff out of it either. Like it's not just an asexual thing, it's an everybody thing, and people forget that. And there are plenty of aces that I know of that have married. There are aces who have found out that the ace, after they had married someone who was heterosexual, and they've found a way to make it work. And it doesn't negate you from having a relationship. I mean, I know that my neurodivergence and my mental health things made relationships complicated because I found that particularly with the ex-husband when we were first dating, he really wanted to be serious emotionally because he wanted everything else that came with that. And I spent a lot of time running away from that because I was like, too much, can't do this. And we were back and forth for a number of years. And then I had to force myself to bite the bullet and go, well, I just have to make this work. And then I realized that I don't actually have to force myself to do anything, like it's, and we actually have a better friendship now than we did when we were married. Well, than when we were together, because he's not harassing me for the sex that he desperately wants that I don't want to have a bar of. And I'm not avoiding hugs or, relationships type stuff because I'm assuming that it's going to lead to something that I don't want. And I'm just, locking that down before it goes anywhere else, and I mean, like communication in our relationship was a bit rubbish. And I think that's really important that if you have a partner and you have a good communication, that goes a long way to understanding each other, whatever orientation you happen to be. And asexuality is no different to any other orientation because the people that want connections, and it doesn't matter whether it's a romantic or it's a platonic connection that you have with people or whatever your attraction, or if you're arrow, you may still have friends or what have you, as long as whatever your emotional needs are, as long as you're getting them met and no one else is getting hurt, then then that's all good by me. Like you just, I guess it's, so I mean, like I know that my son, who is on the ASD spectrum and has ADHD as well, I'm noticing it's becoming more apparent the older he gets, and his social skills are quite lacking. And he's one of the, he wants to be friends, he wants those connections, but he has absolutely no idea how to go about it. And I know that is a very common thread with people on the spectrum. That, I mean, some people on the spectrum do not want to, they don't care about that social connection, but there are, and it seems to get forgotten that there are people on the spectrum who do actually want that and struggle to make those connections. And it really comes down to communication and trying to be understanding, because even if you haven't been through what someone else has been through, if you can be empathetic, then at least that goes a long way. Even if you don't quite get it, you can go, well, you know what? I understand for that person that this is something that's difficult for them, and having that empathy. I mean, that while I might clash with people, I try to be as empathetic as I can, because I might not have been there, but I can empathize, and I can try and put myself in their shoes, and trying to put yourself in your partner's shoes for both partners is vitally important, because that is one of the keys to communication. And having an intimacy with somebody, even if it's not sexual or romantic, having that connection that you want, the kind of connection you want, that will go a long way to making that.
Thanks, Gemma. I hear you. And my next question is for Yagna. Are they still around? I don't see Yagna. My next question is for Yagna, and Tanisha is probably going to type it out for you, Yagna. But my question is, how do you navigate these kind of conversations where you have to tell the other person what you want out of the relationship and what your boundaries are? Have you had these sort of conversations, or have they been, what are the barriers to these conversations? Have they been difficult for you, and in what ways? I'm curious. Is Yagna still here? I don't see them. I saw a comment from them, so I assume they might still be around, but I don't see them around. So I'm just going to jump back to Divya and say that from a therapist point of view, from somebody who's working with these kinds of questions, somebody who's working with these kind of conversations, how do you, these are hard conversations to have. These are systemic issues, right? I remember once when I told someone, somebody told me that they can see Yagna. So Tanisha, if you can help spotlight them and maybe drop them the question via chat, that'd be great. No, not spotlight me, spotlight Yagna. There they are. Yeah. Sorry, Divya, we'll come back to you. But Yagna, I was just wondering what are the barriers that you have to having conversations about intimacies? What do you want out of a relationship, a partnership of any sort? How do you have these conversations, and what are the barriers to them?
Okay, so one thing I'm good with this communication. So I always tell first that I'm hard of hearing, or in my case, disabled person. And the second thing is I right away ask a question what attraction they prefer and the sexuality when they don't mind answering for me. And that's when I talk about my that I bond over whenever there's emotional connection, then only it works for me. It can also be platonic, green platonic relationship, which I'm okay with. And we also tell that that there are times where I lie between pansexual. So they would have to understand this, like putting boundaries, that it's not always the everyday, you know. And there's some days where I'm very active, and there's some days I don't want to engage with this. So this is how I put boundaries. Like communication is not a problem for me, and I do not hesitate to put out my message or my needs. So
But when you put them out,
like,
okay, you take the effort to explain it to them when you're using these terms. Do you take the effort to explain it to them as well, or how is it?
So terms.
Yeah, when you say queer platonic, I'm sure a lot of people don't understand what you mean, right?
Oh, yeah, okay, like, yes, I have to explain it because like, most of the time they do not understand the terms, like, they prefer to understand just like, your needs instead of saying I'm demisexual, or I'm from S community. So it's like when you just explicitly say it, like, I prefer this XX, this that, instead of putting labels. So that is what is bringing the communication forward. Because as always, I've been experimenting with the terms and explanation. And this is the only approach that has worked without putting labels. Like, explicitly say and they say, so hope you know that this is existence, like, like that. That's how I communicate. Yeah, so.
Yeah. And what are the barriers you face? Do you face any struggles with that? Any kind of
Well, sometimes, so especially I actually have a problem, especially with cis men, like, because they don't understand the that sexual libido reduces, or it can be any time.
yeah.
So and also with toxic masculinity. So it also intersects with that. My problems is with toxic masculinity and not with anything else actually. My disability and my sexuality does not come in the way. It is just the society ideology of how sex should be, even if persons without, if persons who do not belong from AS community also faces a problem with explaining or getting satisfied with asexual terms, which is right. So for me, the barrier is like explaining that sex is different for each person's, how
Yeah.
we react to it and how we deal with it. So that is my barrier.
Yeah, I hear you. I think the idea of sex is always limited to, penis and vagina sort of an interaction. And
Yes, that's
yeah,
right.
whereas sex can be so much more, even phone sex, like
Yeah,
sexting with
yes,
sex.
yes.
Yeah, I hear you. Thanks for sharing that, Yagna. And I wanted to come back to Divya, and then I will wrap up by going to Safal after this. But Divya, how do you, in your therapy room, how do you hold this tension? How do you let people know that you don't need to have it all figured out? You don't need to always know, like, this is the label you need to subscribe to. This is how you have to have sex. This is how you have to conduct your relationships. How do you hold that tension, and how do you build those skills in your client to hold that tension?
I think this is a really good question, right? Because this gives insight into how people can open up. So, like I mentioned earlier, my approach is social constructions, which means that when somebody tells me something that this is my reality, and that this is how I've constructed it, I will not say no to that. Which means that I will never be the person coming forward and saying something along the lines of, "No, but that's not how it works, right?" Or wait,
But
this
then
is
the
not how it's.
client might, right? Like, I remember so many times when I was in therapy room and I wanted a label because, yeah, I wanted the safety of a label. I was just
Yeah,
like, tell me what I am so
yeah,
I can figure out my experience. So how do
right.
you,
And that's so
yeah,
difficult to achieve for clients, because when they go to a therapist, therapists tend to have their existing schools of
yeah,
thought. And which means that if you come from a school of thought where labels are important, I mean, it's not a format of therapy, but if you just are one of those people, um, you're then also one of those people who wants diagnoses before you want to start
yeah,
work. Right?
yeah,
So if you are one of those professionals, then it's not going to be possible sometimes for you to even have the conversation, because conversations often demand labels. In
yeah,
fact, that's why labels exist. If you think about it, they are there so
yeah,
that we can use them in conversation, in language. Um, so the trick, what I have discovered through a lot of permutation and combination, is that for the longest time, it's about. I just allowed my clients to just speak their truth for as long as they wanted to. That's why I say their truth, because it's their reality. And the ultimate realization for them doesn't have to happen right away. I think the most important thing is that they feel comfortable speaking up and saying what they want to say. And they also about feeling comfortable in not saying things. Like, there is a pressure that when you're in therapy, you have to say things, which I
yeah,
don't think is the truth. Just like there is no one definition for sex or sexuality or anything for that matter. There is no, for me, there is not one definition for therapy also. I'm very, I kind of go with that. I don't really do a lot of pre-preparation before I get into a session, barring, whatever I have to do in terms of getting myself mentally oriented to the fact that I'm going in. So I think that really helps. So, and I use mindfulness practices, which means that it's about what you're feeling right now. And this can be
Grounding.
invalidated literally the next second, and that will be fine.
Yeah.
But I'm very happy that we're talking about communication and communication barriers, because so many of these challenges about identity and about conveying who we are to the other person, Gemma and Kate, I've just been seeing your messages in the chat box. Everything you've talked about, like Kate mentioned, that it didn't end because I was asexual, it ended because of the communication barrier, which is so true. Because why should it have to be such a tremendous thing for you that I identify as something? All you really need to do is reach out to me and ask me questions, to be curious about me, and understand me, and see what my way of being in love with you is. I am in love with you a certain way, and you're in love with me maybe another way, and what is so wrong with that, right? So if you cannot execute that communication, then it was always a problem, right? It's not because I was asexual, or I mean, that was the whole cornerstone. People don't understand that that's what relationships are about, not sex or even hugging and romance, for that matter. It's communication.
They're all part of it. Yeah. They're all elements of a relationship. Thanks, Divya. Safal, I have this question for you. How do you have these complex conversations about identities with people in the community, especially if they don't speak English, or if they don't speak, the languages in which these terms are? How do you have this conversation with them?
So, like, how do I have conversation with the people in the community about? Like,
are there terms in Nepali, or are you building terms?
Yeah, there is a term in Nepali that, like, every country, every nations have their own language and term on the gender and sexuality, and everybody does. And we talk mostly in Nepali, and we make understand about through the Nepali languages, like from like. Even though many pages are like Nepalese asexuality queer youth group and has published in the Nepali, or like how they have been pronounced in Nepali too. Like from that we advocate and we educate the people, and from the last decades, like terminology also had been changes, like in English in Nepali too, but it's quite hard to adapt, but it's so easy when you adapt everything slowly. Yeah, we transfer, we give knowledge, and we share our experience through all in Nepali language rather than English, because it helps to understand people, and it quite helpful to make people more visible about what's gender and sexuality. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, a lot of times I see this in India. You tell me if it happens with you in your experience in Nepal, where a lot of times these identities, these queer ways of being, are seen as imports from Western culture, right? So I feel like when it is articulated in the local language, there is also a better sense of comfort with aligning with it.
Yeah, also about talking about the local language, I just remember that one of the queer youth group which published I'm also the one of the member of the queer youth group, and we are publishing in a different local language on Nepal, and that will help to understand people from the different community, indigenous community, like every community help to understand what is gender and sexuality in their community, and what's the local language, how they should use that local language too. Yeah.
Thanks, Safal. So we're going to be opening up for questions from the audience. I'm going to turn to Tanisha once again to help me curate questions from the audience. Could you just send them to me as they come in, Tanisha? Or is there something that I can find in chat?
There are no questions in the chat as for now, but I would insist if people start sending the questions in the chat so that I can give them to Rishi and she can ask the questions respectively.
That sounds good.
Thank you so much.
That sounds good. Thanks, Anisha. In the meantime, any closing remarks? We'll start with Kate. Kate, how did this being on this panel make you feel? And is there something, things that you related to, things you want to add that you hadn't mentioned earlier? We'd love to hear that.
I don't know, it's very hard going first. Yeah, I think, yeah, just reading Gemma's comment there. Yeah, I think it's been a really great conversation that's kind of gone off in a different direction than expected. But yeah, just talking about in communication and the importance of talking. And I think that's such a great thing, because in asexuality, we have so much language that we've created in asexuality for talking about things to describe who we are and how we relate to sex and sexuality. You know, we have the sex repulsion spectrum. We have you know, we talk about being sex repulsed or sex positive or sex favorable, but at the same time, you know, we can also be sex negative or sex positive in terms of, in general. We talk about, you know, our romantic orientation. We talk about sensual attraction. We talk about aesthetic attraction. We have so many different words to talk about all these different things, and asexuality has such a broad spectrum of language to it. So I think that's a really exciting thing, to be part of a community that has so much language to allow us to talk about so many aspects of ourselves and who we are.
Thanks, Kate. Gemma, what are your closing comments, and how did you feel about being part of this panel?
I think it's really good that we had neurodivergence and disability intertwined in the one panel, because we actually have ours separated. Our neurodivergent panel and our disability panel are separated. And I felt that I couldn't go on the disability panel because I'm neurodivergent, but I've never used the disability label to describe myself. But I was looking at the list of diagnoses that I have, and I'm like, well, if that's not enough, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a conversation that Kate and I had about trauma last year when we did our trauma panel, that I didn't consider the things that I'd been through as trauma, just because I assumed it was the relationship things that I'd been through were just what happened. And Kate and a couple of the others kind of went, no, that's actually considered coercion, and that bit, that's definitely trauma. And it took my psychologist to tell me, because I went, oh yeah, no, you know, and everybody noticed. One of the points that I had made when I was writing out the reasons I'd left was that my ex-husband had made me pay for things when I had 10% of his income and he had 90% of the income for the household. And I had to pay him back for things that were necessary, like bras, you know, and I was like, oh, you know, that's just him being fussy about money. But it took communicating that to my ace friends, like Kate did with her trauma, for me to be able to unpack it a little bit more and go, hang on, okay, maybe. And even my psychologist went, no, that's financial control. That's not normal, you know. You shouldn't expect that in a relationship. And I think I've been separated for about 2.5 years, and now that time has given me a lot of opportunity to be able to work out what I want. And as Kate and I were comparing in the thing, you know, we both would really like a QPPP, you know, and like really being able to understand yourself is really important. That's why communication amongst ACEs and in the relationships they have is really important. But also the language, as Kate was saying, we have such a diverse language that we can tap into, and there's so many micro labels that I don't even know the definitions of. But if it helps somebody understand themselves, then I think it's important.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Divya, I'm going to come to you next. How has it been as a therapist and as somebody who identifies with all these identities themselves? How has it been for you? And what has it gotten you thinking about?
Humans are so strange, as I has just put. I think, okay, I've said I think thrice now. the thing with neurodivergence, and I think also Pragati has asked this question in the chat box. So I just saw it. I'm going to say this: whether there is an intersection between being on the A spectrum and being on the autistic spectrum. There's a correlation. I want to talk about that because I feel that very, very personally. We are not often allowed to be ourselves as it is. When you're neurodivergent, you're just not allowed to be who you are on so many occasions, starting right from when we're little kids. I did talk about the classroom scenario, which keeps coming back to me again and again because it's so relevant. But we are constantly masking, right? That's a term in the literature. We have something called masking that we do. And even when we look at television characters, movie characters, we see these awkward, so to speak, awkward, klutzy characters who are often seen as those people who don't know how to socially engage, don't know how to flirt, and are also often called Ace. There is a show, I think it's Gilmore Girls, where one of the characters is called Ace. And it just keeps pricking me. I'm like, why are you doing this? Just because, and she's portrayed as somebody who's studious, who doesn't do this whole thing, so to speak, flirting with people. So she's called Ace. And I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Right? So there are multiple experiences that I've had which were similar. I may not have been called Ace, but I was considered this person who, she will just not get it. She will just not understand why we are constantly talking about boys. I went to a girls' school and I just could not understand why everyone went on talking about boys 24 hours. And I'm like, but there are other things in life. Why isn't this happening? I'm curious. And that doesn't mean I'm studious or I'm a nerd. Why is it only these two categories? That either I'm a nerd or I'm this
hypersexual
person. Yes. So it's been hard. It's been also hard to be in relationships, to be very honest, because I haven't mentioned any of it here because I think there's so much. If I went into that, this would take forever. But relationships have just been hard because going into relationships, when the attraction component was working, I always thought that, okay, I like this person. It must mean that we are meant to be together forever. That's it. But there are so many other components of relationships that we don't know about. And then when we learn that sex is different from romance, and that sex is an entity in itself, and that I may not want to do that ever, or I may not feel that need for it at all. It starts to really sort of, throw a lot of questions in your face, and it becomes very, very confusing. So there is a correlation, I feel, between autism spectrum and A spectrum, but there is no research to back it up. So it'll be very hard to say it that, there's very little research in this domain. There is research that might suggest that there are overlapping components between being just part of the LGBTQIA spectrum and neurodivergence. That is there. I have heard that also in many, many forums. But I'm not too sure if it is entirely overlapping with asexuality and autism, because I think there's very little research to back it up. And I wish there was more research, because all the research of the world is just centered around the white population in the West. And somebody come and do the research here, please, in Asia. We need to know this. We need to understand what is going on here with our sexuality, with our gender identities, with neurodivergence, because there is a whole world of overlap, which we're not even looking at.
I think as an autistic person, I just feel a lot of inertia into absorbing some of the social constructs, including hypersexuality, allosexuality, which is imposed on me. So I don't know if there's an overlap per se, but I just think the autistic self in me just comes out to question these constructs and like, why is there these expectations of me, and why, if consent matters, then why can't I consent to never participating this, or participating this only on certain terms, right? So I think that's where I think the conversation overlaps between the autistic self and the ACE self. I'm going to move to, but thank you so much for that, sharing that, Divya. Moving on to Safal, what are your closing remarks, and how has it been? Does your work as a queer affirmative therapist, counselor in your society, in your community, also include talking to them about sex in different ways? Sex, not just penis and vagina, but sex as a sensual, erotic experience.
So in my experience as a counselor, as a student of the counselor student, as my experience was so much toxicity because my teachers always talk about penis and vagina only, and so even the counselor who teach me about that, they just talk about the persons can be only attracted with the male and female person, which is quite not relatable for me, and
Yeah.
I was offended always, and I just brushed it out. No, that's not wrong. That's so wrong. I can't say. And even I put my pronouns in they, them, and you are just quite confused why you are putting this. And even it shows that our counselor, our teachers, our practitioners are not much aware about these topics also. And being myself and counting on as in the spectrum of the as, I feel like it's all about emotions and bonding to whom you are attracted and
Yeah.
whom you are attracted. And for me, and it always being something that I need to more explore myself, and it's something that I am exploring a lot. And yeah,
Cool.
that's
Thanks
my
so much, Safar. Thank you, Safar. And finally, Yagna, what are your closing remarks? I see you talking about casteism and how that has also shaped a lot of your social interactions. What do you have to say? You're on mute, by the way, Yagna.
Oh no, I'm actually from upper caste Bengal, but I'm passionate about advocating the rights of caste, lower caste Bengal. So I was just explaining because they asked, that was it.
No, but what are your closing remarks as well? How have you felt being part of this
So
panel? Yeah.
actually, first thing, is there an app for folks like us? Is there an app like dating app basically for us?
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah.
much to tell me about it. And second of all, I'm so thankful for giving me the chance to put out my experiences in regards to S community. I've never spoken about this, not thought much about it. But after Sneha sent me this video about the previous interaction similar to this, it was very insightful, and I also learned many things. So I have also learned many things from you all in this panel, and I thank for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Yagna. And I think with that, we come to the close of this panel. We are about 8 minutes to time, and I think the next panel starts sharp at 1. So, yeah. But Gemma, before we close, do you want to talk more about how Australia has an interesting position as a country that's white dominated, but not necessarily part of the global north?
Yeah. So during the preparation for International Asexuality Day, there was a lot of conversations about making sure that we highlighted non-Anglophone countries, particularly non-UK or non-North American countries. And there were quite a lot of European countries where English is not their first language that were very much in this ballpark. But we had a lot of trouble trying. Well, not trouble. It was harder to find representation in Africa and Asia. And one thing that's important to Kate and I and a lot of the other, and some of the other ACE representation that we have is that we know the privilege that we have in Australia, in that we do have white privilege, and we do have the Anglophone privilege of being able to connect with resources and being able to read and understand the resources in our first language that the US and the UK have made. And we really find it important because, and I guess it is partly because Australia is so multicultural, that it highlights to us that privilege is really obvious to Kate and I.
Yeah.
And we know that we're one of the bigger asexual communities in the Asia Pacific region. So we try to connect with the people in our region, because we know that, you know, trying to get somebody from Nepal or Bangladesh or any of the, or, you know, anywhere from that in the Asia Pacific region, or even Indonesia or Thailand, any of those countries, getting that we have more in common with them because of the region than them trying to connect with the US and them trying to understand what it's like being in Israel. And I mean, we do have, I mean, admittedly, we don't know exactly what it's like, but we know, we have a better understanding than some of the other more Anglophone speaking countries. And particularly given that we have never been able to find a resource for any of the Micronesian countries or Polynesian countries or any of the other Oceania countries that are part of our region as well, that we try to be as loud and as obvious as we can, so that maybe if somebody from there sees that, they know that there's somebody just over the water that they can talk to that has a bit better understanding of where they're coming from, as opposed to someone 12 hours away who isn't on their same time zone. And I guess I guess that's why it's really important to have panels where we do have conversations with people who don't live in the same country as us, because it's really good to hear other perspectives. And I know when Kate and I did Bangladeshi ACE's panel last year, it really opened our eyes up to the privilege that we had, because they were things that panelists talked about that just don't happen in Australia. And I mean, we knew we had a privilege, but we didn't realize quite how much, you know. And I mean, I have family that live in Indonesia. They live in Bali at the moment, but I have Indonesian relatives. My auntie's married men from Java. And my cousin, who is Aloe, she fell pregnant to her boyfriend. And she had to get married before she went and saw the doctor about the pregnancy, because otherwise she would have been ostracized, even though she's half Australian and half Indonesian. And she had to, I mean, not that she didn't want to marry him, but she had to rush it. Like, she had to organize it in a month, because before she was showing enough for anyone to notice, she had to go and get married. And she had no family over there, because it was so late notice, and it was in the middle of December when it's school holidays in Australia. So her mum and her, I think her mum came over and her brother, and maybe they had 4 people from family, extended family in Australia, and we just couldn't get there.
Yeah.
And
no, I think what you're trying to say really speaks to what I believe in, that, all oppression is connected. When we're talking about queer affirmative therapy, when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we also have to realize that anti-racism, like mental health, is political. Anti-racism, anti-casteism, all that practice, that work that goes into understanding and deconstructing these systems, they're all connected with each other's, access to justice. So I hear you.
Yeah, I knew that it would be viewed differently over there, but I didn't realize how different it was until my cousin and I are quite close. We have a really good relationship, but I know that there are things that Kate and I have access to that would be very difficult for many people in many of the countries within, a 5-hour flight, say an 8-hour flight radius from Australia, just because we come from colonial British dickheads coming to settle our country. And I know
it's good to hear it from a white person.
Yeah. There are plenty of people who don't realize the privilege they have. And and it's still, accessing healthcare and Medicare and medical professionals, there are still challenges in Australia. Don't get me wrong. It costs my psychologist charges me very little over what I get from our universal healthcare, but paying for a psychiatrist, my psychiatrist charges over $300 for a session, and I get maybe $120 back. And the only reason that I can afford this is because I see him really, really rarely, and I have a money put aside to be able to do this. But those kind of figures, those kind of numbers, are not available for a lot of people. And that's why they don't end up with a diagnosis. It's why they don't end up seeking therapy or medication, because the access is there.
Yeah, we hear you. We live these realities.
You know, and
Thank you so much, Gemma.
and it's far more amplified in your countries than it is in Australia, but it still exists.
Yes.
And it's shit. It's really, really rubbish because people go, oh, you know, you need to get over it. You need to deal with this, and you need to do this and that. And just like, how the hell am I supposed to do it if I can't get access to it? How the hell am I supposed to start coping with something if I can't see someone who can help me start the process? I can't get medication to treat my depression. So it's not just the hurdle of, well, you need to deal with it. Well, yes, okay, we get that, but there's costs and there's contact. I mean,
there is so much to it that is, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. I hear you.
I mean, trying to get a psychologist.
No, we really have to wrap up this section right now because about a minute to go to the next one. But it's nice to hear about how you see these differences and how you're unpacking them for yourself as well. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for being part of the session. I will wrap this session up right now and pass on the mic back to the organizers. PanACEa, Pragati, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being part of this panel. It's been a wonderful discussion and a lot of insight into how disability and neurodiversity intersect with asexuality. And it's been, for me, for someone who is part of this organizing team, this has been my most treasured panel of sorts. I've been trying to get people to come in, and it's been like my thing. I wanted this panel to happen so badly. So thanks for that. Thanks for making this happen. Thank you, Tejasvi, for moderating this wonderful session in such a wonderful manner and in an amazing manner as well. And every one of you were amazing. It was such pleasure to hear you all talk and hear you all discuss what is actually affecting you and what are the barriers you face and how you overcome them. It's so inspirational and it's so wonderful to see you all talk. And Pragati, if you have any closing remarks to add on, please do so.
We're good to go. Thank you everyone for an incredibly insightful session. Thank you so much for putting your heart into the conversation that we were having. I could sense it. We're going to see you back at 2 for a very fun workshop, writing ace characters. I think that's going to be super interesting and I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. Thanks again. Bye-bye.